Imagine descending into a chamber that smells of salt and rot. The air is thick, damp, clinging to your skin like a second baptism. The walls weep. And in the center, a congregation. They are not screaming. They are not fleeing. They are waiting. This is not a metaphor. This is the opening movement of Alan Moore's Neonomicon, a work that has been called many things: pornographic, indefensible, a masterpiece, a betrayal. But perhaps the most honest description is this: it is a religious text, not in spite of its horror, because of it. Because what Moore understands, what he forces us to confront, is that horror has always been a religious technology. That fear has always been the oldest form of worship. That the things we call filth, the abject, the polluted, the unspeakable, have always been the boundary markers of the sacred. In Neonomicon, Moore presents us with a cult, the esoteric order of Dagon. But unlike the cults we're used to seeing in horror, deluded fanatics worshipping false gods, these believers are depicted as the only ones who understand the truth, the only ones who have looked into the abyss and recognized it not as an absence of meaning, but as a new law, a Neonomicon, a new scripture, a new covenant written not in stone or parchment, but in flesh, in language, in the ritualized transgression of every boundary civilized society holds sacred. And this raises a question that will not let us go. Is Moore depicting depravity?
Or is he revealing how depravity becomes divinity? How fear and filth are not the enemies of faith, but its raw materials. H.P. Lovecraft once wrote that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. But Moore takes this further. He argues that fear doesn't just accompany religion, it is religion.
That the sacred is not discovered in purity, but in pollution, not in transcendence, but in transgression. This is the Trinity at the heart of Neonomicon: faith, fear, and filth. Faith, the human need to impose meaning on chaos, to build systems of order even when confronted with cosmic indifference. Fear, the primal emotion that binds communities, that creates in-groups and out-groups, that makes certain ideas and acts feel supernaturally dangerous. Filth, the limit case, the boundary violation, the thing that defines the sacred precisely by being cast out, forbidden, unclean. And Moore's thesis is this: these three are not separate. They are a single engine, a religious machine that runs on disgust and dread, that turns horror into holiness, that makes worship out of violation. Over the next half hour, we're going to trace how this machine works. We'll begin with its historical and philosophical foundations, the theories of the sacred, the abject, and transgression that Moore is drawing from. Then we'll dissect its psychological mechanics, the disgust responses, death anxieties, and link. To understand what Alan Moore is doing in Neonomicon, we need to start with the man whose shadow looms over every page: Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Lovecraft's fiction created a new kind of horror, cosmic horror, a vision of the universe not as a place of divine order, but as an indifferent machine grinding along according to geometries and entities so alien that human consciousness cannot survive contact with them. His gods, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, are not beings to be worshipped in the traditional sense. They are facts, terrible, sanity-annihilating facts about the true nature of reality. And yet, his stories are full of cults: the esoteric order of Dagon, the cult of Cthulhu, secret societies preserving forbidden texts, grimoires like the Necronomicon that contain the true names, the ritual formulae, the law required to contact these entities. These cults function as proto-religious structures. They have hierarchies, initiations, sacred languages, ritual practices, and they are always depicted as existing at the margins, coastal towns populated by degenerate mixed-race communities, immigrants, the poor. Lovecraft's racism is not subtext, it is text. His horror of the other is inseparable from his cosmic dread. But here's what's often missed. These cults are also doing something profoundly religious. They are creating meaning in a meaningless universe. They are building community around shared knowledge of the terrible. They are drawing boundaries, sacred and profane, initiated and uninitiated, clean and unclean. And this brings us to the first pillar of understanding. Neonomicon, the nature of the sacred itself. The sociologist Emil Durkheim argued that religion is not fundamentally about belief in gods. It is about the creation of a binary, the sacred versus the profane. The sacred is whatever a community sets apart, protects, ritualizes. The profane is the everyday, the ordinary, the mundane, and the boundary between them is maintained through ritual, through taboo, through acts that remind the community what must be protected and what must be kept out. Mary Douglas, in her landmark work, Purity and Danger, showed us that filth is not an objective category. It is matter out of place. Dirt on the floor is just dirt. Dirt on your dinner plate is pollution. The same substance becomes filthy when it crosses a boundary. And these boundary violations are not trivial. They feel viscerally wrong because they threaten the conceptual order that allows us to navigate the world. This is why bodily fluids horrify us, why certain foods become taboo, why sexual transgressions feel supernaturally dangerous. They threaten the boundaries that define us, between inside and outside, self and other, pure and impure. Rudolf Otto gave us another piece of the puzzle. He argued that the core of religious experience is the numinous, the encounter with the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the tremendous, fascinating mystery. This is the experience of standing before something so vast, so powerful, so utterly other that it fills you with terror and awe simultaneously. You want to flee. You cannot look away. This paradox, revulsion and attraction, is the heartbeat of the sacred. Julia Kristeva took this further with her concept of abjection. The abject is not just the disgusting, it is that which destabilizes identity and meaning. The corpse, the wound, the bodily fluid. These things remind us that the boundaries of the self are fragile, that I can dissolve, that the solid categories we depend on are illusions. Horror, Kristeva argues, works by confronting us with the abject, by forcing us to stare at the limits of the self until those limits begin to blur. And then there's Georges Bataille, who spent his life thinking about transgression. Bataille argued that the sacred is not found in obedience to the law, but in its violation. That eroticism, true eroticism, not just sex, is the experience of crossing a forbidden boundary. It is the space where death and desire intersect, where the self risks dissolution in the air. Now we descend into the engine room. We've established the historical and philosophical context. Now we ask, how does this work? What are the psychological mechanisms that allow fear and filth to become the building blocks of faith? Let's start with disgust. Disgust is not a simple emotion. The psychologist Paul Rosen spent decades mapping its contours. He identified what he called the laws of contagion and similarity. Once something is contaminated, it remains contaminated even after the contaminant is removed. A sterilized cockroach in your soup still ruins the soup, and things that merely resemble contaminants can trigger the same response. A piece of chocolate shaped like feces is repulsive, even though you know it's chocolate. Disgust operates according to a kind of sympathetic magic. It treats symbolic contamination as if it were literal, and this makes it extraordinarily powerful for creating and policing boundaries. Jonathan Haidt, building on Razin's work, identified sanctity and degradation as one of the moral foundations that structure human societies. Purity norms, ideas about what is clean and unclean, sacred and profane, are not universal, but wherever they appear, they are potent. They become markers of identity. Violations feel not just wrong, but supernaturally wrong. They trigger moral outrage, social punishment, and the creation of in-groups and out-groups. This is the first mechanism, disgust as a boundary-making tool. In Neonomicon, Moore weaponizes this. The cult's rituals are designed to cross every line of purity the reader holds. Sexual violence, bodily violation, genetic contamination. These are not random provocations. They are calculated tests. They sort the world into those who can endure the abject and those who cannot, those who can be initiated and those who remain outside. Now add death. Ernest Becker, in The Denial of Death, argued that the human awareness of mortality creates a fundamental terror. We are animals who know we're going to die, and this knowledge is unbearable. So we build symbolic systems, culture, religion, nationalism, legacy, that promise immortality. Not literal immortality, but symbolic. Your name will live on, your bloodline will continue, your works will endure. Terror management theory, developed by Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pischinsky, provided experimental evidence for Becker's thesis. When people are reminded of death, even subliminally, they cling more tightly to their cultural worldviews. They become more hostile to outsiders. They punish those who deviate from group norms. Death anxiety doesn't make us philosophical. It makes us tribal. Cosmic horror is death anxiety at civilizational scale. Lovecraft's entities represent not just individual mortality, but the erasure of human meaning itself. The extinction of our species, our planet, our entire timeline is cosmically irrelevant. This is the ultimate death cue, and the cult in Neonomicon responds exactly as terror management theory predicts, by clinging to a worldview that promises meaning in the face of annihilation. But the meaning it offers is not transcendence, it is participation. You cannot defeat the cosmic order, you can only join it. And joining requires sacrifice. This brings us to the third mechanism, costly signaling. Anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists have long observed that the most committed religious communities are those with the most demanding rituals. The Shakers required celibacy. Monastic orders demand poverty and obedience. Initiation rites across cultures involve pain, humiliation, public exposure. Why? Because costly rituals filter for commitment. If you're willing to endure pain or humiliation to join a group, you're less likely to be a free rider or a defector. The cost acts as a bond. And paradoxically, the harder the initiation, the more valuable membership feels afterward. We justify the sacrifice by elevating the group. Cognitive dissonance becomes devotion. In Neonomicon, transgression functions as a costly signal. The characters who participate in the cult's rituals are marked. They cannot return to their former lives. They have crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. And this creates a perverse loyalty. The more horrific the act, the more it binds. Moore is showing us the logic of extremism, how atrocity can become sacrament. But there's another layer, the erotics of transgression. Bataille argued that eroticism is not just about pleasure, it is about the dissolution of boundaries. The moment of orgasm is a little death, a temporary annihilation of the self. And this is why sex and death are so intimately linked in religious and psychological symbolism. Both involve crossing a threshold. Both involve the surrender of control. Transgression, in Bataille's framework, is the path to the sacred. To touch the forbidden is to touch the divine. Not because the forbidden. So let's turn the lens outward. Let's look at the world we're living in right now. Because the mechanisms we've been dissecting, discussed, death anxiety, costly rituals, linguistic initiation. These are not relics of ancient cults or fictional horror stories. They are the operating system of our contemporary moment. Start with social media. Every platform runs on the same basic fuel, engagement. And engagement, the engineers discovered, is driven most powerfully by high arousal emotions, not contentment, not calm, but outrage, fear, disgust. The algorithm doesn't care about truth. It cares about what keeps you scrolling. And what keeps you scrolling is the same thing that kept our ancestors vigilant on the savannah. Threats, violations, moral contamination. Your feed has become a liturgical calendar, a cycle of sin, confession, atonement, and excommunication. Every day a new heresy is identified. Every week, a new ritual of public shaming. The language is explicitly religious, toxic, unclean, contaminated, degenerate. These are purity terms, and they function exactly as Mary Douglas described. They mark boundaries. They create in-groups and out-groups. They tell you where the danger is. But here's the twist. Both the danger and the outrage are algorithmically curated. You are being initiated into a reality that the machine is constructing in real time based on what provokes the strongest visceral response from you. This is our modern ACLO. Look at the language ecosystems that have emerged online. QAnon has its own lexicon, the storm, trust the plan, WWG1WGA. Incel forums have theirs, black pill, Chad, hypergamy. Every ideological subculture develops jargon that functions as a gatekeeping mechanism. If you don't speak the language, you're outside. If you do, you're initiated. You see what others cannot see. And these aren't just words, they're spells. They reshape perception. They create patterns of thought that are self-reinforcing. Repeat a term enough times and it becomes a lens, a reality tunnel, a way of organizing experience that feels not like interpretation, but like revelation. This is the mimetic power of language. Speech acts that don't describe the world. They mobilize action in the world. And many of these online communities are functionally religious. Conspiracy movements like QAnon have every element of a faith tradition, an apocalyptic narrative, the battle between good and evil, an elect, those who are awake, sacred texts, the drops, the leaks, evangelism, spreading the word through shares and hashtags, and a promise of salvation. The storm will come, justice will be served, the truth will be revealed. They even have a devil, the hidden cabal, the shadowy elite, the forces of contamination and corruption. And the initiation is cognitive. You take the red pill. You wake up. You see what was always there but hidden. And the most seductive part? The feeling of gnosis, secret knowledge, the experience of being one of the few who understand the real shape of the world while everyone else sleeps. This is not new. This is Gnosticism. This is the mystery cults of antiquity. This is every esoteric tradition that has ever promised the initiated a truth too dangerous for the masses. Now layer in disgust. Every ideological tribe, left, right, center, fringe, uses sanctity rhetoric to define itself. Toxic masculinity. Degeneracy. Cultural Marxism. Fascism. These terms don't just describe behaviors, they moralize them. They place them in the category of the abject, the contaminated, the impure. And the rituals of call-out culture, cancel culture, digital shunning, these are excommunication rites. They are boundary enforcement. They mark who is inside and who is outside, who is clean and who is polluted. Mary Douglas would recognize this immediately. So would Durkheim. The sacred and profane boundary is being drawn and redrawn, constantly, in real time, by crowds of people performing collective rituals they don't recognize as religious. And then there are the fandoms. Fandoms have always had quasi-religious structures, canon and lore, pilgrimage to conventions, relics in the form of merchandise. But in an age where traditional religious affiliation is declining, fandoms have become micro-churches, places where people gather to participate in shared myth-making, where identity is forged, where belonging is found. And when canon is violated, when a new film or book betrays the lore, the response is religious rage. Heresy has been committed. The sacred text has been defiled. This is not metaphor. This is the same psychological machinery that powered medieval schisms and holy wars. The stakes feel existential because identity is at stake. And identity, for creatures like us, is everything. Now let's talk about the economy of filth. Shock content is monetized. Algorithms reward the transgressive because it's sticky, it provokes, it engages. Doom scrolling, the compulsive consumption of horrific news, graphic content, rage bait, has become a daily ritual. We perform it, not because it makes us happy, but because it makes us feel. It is a sacrament of dread. A way of staying connected to the overwhelming horror of the world, a way of bearing witness, a way of feeling informed, righteous, alive. But it is also a way of being initiated, over and over, into a worldview of threat and contamination. The algorithm is the high priest, the feed is the altar, and we return, daily, to offer our attention. And during the pandemic, we saw purity codes emerge almost overnight. Masking became moralized. Distancing became a sign of virtue or cowardice, depending on your tribe. Contamination talk, always latent in human psychology, exploded into explicit moral theater. This is not to argue for or against any particular public health measure. It is to observe that the language around these measures was immediately sacralized. Compliance became purity. Violation became sin. Fear of contagion is ancient. It predates germ theory by millennia. And when triggered, it activates the same disgust-based boundary-making that structures all purity religions. Which brings us back to Neonomicon. The debate around the comic mirrors broader culture war debates about art, harm, and complicity. Is confronting objection a form of critique, or does it reproduce the violence it claims to examine? Is it ethical to depict transgression even in the name of analysis? Who gets to decide? And who is protected or harmed by those decisions? These are not easy questions. Moore's work sits at the knife's edge. It risks offense in order to expose the mechanics of offense. It uses shock to reveal how shock works. But that doesn't immunize it from critique. Context, consent, care, these matter. Ethical spectatorship requires vigilance. But here's the meta-level question Neonomicon forces us to ask. If the new law is written by code, by algorithms optimizing for engagement through disgust and dread, whose sacred are we obeying? What rituals are we performing when we click, share, shun, scroll? And are we worshiping gods we chose, or gods that chose us? Because the machine doesn't ask permission. It just runs. And it runs on the same fuel as every cult, every religion, every meaning-making structure humanity has ever built. Faith, fear, filth. The triad is ancient, but the altar is new. So here we are, at the end of the descent. We've traced the machinery from Lovecraft's cosmic pessimism through the theories of the sacred, the abject, and transgression. We've dissected the psychological engine, disgust, death anxiety, costly rituals, linguistic spells. We've mapped it onto the algorithmic liturgies and outrage economies of our present moment. And now the question Moore leaves us with, the one we cannot avoid. What do we do with this knowledge? Because Neonomicon is not a cautionary tale in the traditional sense. It doesn't offer a path to redemption or a hero who defeats the monster. It ends with a birth. The cult's work is complete. The revelation is manifest. A new reality has entered the world, and the rational civilized order represented by the FBI agents is finished. The new law is written, and it cannot be unwritten. But Moore's wager, the reason he risked offense, The reason he made Lovecraft's subtext into brutal text is that confrontation is the only honest path. That you cannot critique what you refuse to name. That the subtext left buried does more harm than the text made explicit. Lovecraft's horror was always about sex, contamination, racial panic. But by leaving it implicit, by coding it in atmosphere and suggestion, he allowed those anxieties to operate unchallenged. Moore drags them into the light, not to celebrate them, but to indict them, to show how fear becomes theology when we don't examine it. And the discomfort you feel reading Neonomicon, or hearing about it, or even thinking about it, is the point. That discomfort is the boundary being tested. The disgust response is the alarm system, and Moore is asking, what is this alarm protecting? What are you so afraid to look at? Because here's the synthesis. Faith, fear, and filth are not separate forces. They are a single engine. And that engine doesn't just run in horror comics or ancient cults. It runs in you, in me, in every human community that has ever drawn a line between sacred and profane, pure and polluted, us and them. The question is not whether we participate in this machinery. We do. The question is whether we do so consciously. So let me ask you directly, what do you sacralize without noticing? What have you made holy without examining why? Is it safety, comfort, your political tribe, your aesthetic preferences, your disgust responses? What rituals do you perform daily that are motivated not by love or truth but by fear? The doom scroll, the outrage share, the quick judgment, the dismissal of the abject without inquiry. What filth have you used to draw a boundary that protects you or imprisons you? What have you cast out as impure in order to feel clean? And what might you learn if you looked at it? Because the history of the sacred is also the history of scapegoating, of casting out the contaminated, of defining the community by what it excludes. And every exclusion, no matter how justified it feels, carries a cost. Moore's work is dangerous because it makes this visible. It holds up a mirror to the mechanisms we depend on to feel safe, righteous, and sane. And it asks, what if those mechanisms are also the ones that create monsters? What if the purity you defend is also a prison?